Paul McNamara, our policy correspondent, you've had quite the year. I've had quite the year. We've all had quite the year. Let's look back then at 2022.
Firstly, I want to say sorry.
Boris Johnson fighting for his political life right now.
The dawn chorus that no one wants to hear. Air raid sirens in Kyiv.
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
I am confident that together we can ride out the storm.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history.
The half-mast of history. The crowds gathered. The royal notice posted. The Queen is dead.
Tax cuts funded by massive borrowing in hope of growth sends the pound tumbling.
I am resigning.
I will work day in, day out for the British people.
Ambulance drivers and paramedics have joined nurses and postal workers, railway drivers, bus drivers, civil servants, as well as some teachers and university lecturers in going on strike.
In a weird twist, I'm not going to go to the beginning of the year. I want to actually start where we are right now in terms of a lot of those issues coming to a head with this sort of so-called winter of discontent, especially with the cost of living crisis and with a number of strikes going on right now as we speak. We've seen train strikes, the Royal Mail, nurses, ambulance drivers, driving examiners, Heathrow baggage handlers, and Border Force staff, and most of those strikes have been in England and Wales. Is this basically a general strike?
I mean, for all intents and purposes, we're getting to that point. Yeah. I think you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone in the country right now who isn't affected in some way, shape or form, or hasn't had their life impacted in some way because there's just so many different sectors that are striking right now.
What's it all about? It is basically cost of living, inflation. A lot of the workers are saying, we want pay rises in line with inflation, and the government's saying, actually, we can't do that because there's not enough money, and also that would make inflation worse. Is that basically it?
Yes, pretty much. Next question. Yeah, pretty much. But I mean, you look at nurses. I was going through the numbers just the other day. If you look at nurses' pay since 2010, it's gone up by about 20% in cash terms. But prices have gone up, I think, about 32%. So you're looking at real terms, pay cut for them. Mm-hmm. And then you look at nurses' pay compared to private sector pay. Private sector pay has gone up considerably more. Even compared to other public sector workers, nurses have fared worse than all of them. So this has been a long time coming now. The line that the government is falling back on is, well, look, there was an independent pay review. We go along with their recommendations. But when that pay review was, when they went through that process, inflation wasn't what it is right now. We've got the second highest inflation rate in 40 odd years. The highest inflation rate in 40 odd years was last month. It was a different world when that pay review was sorted.
And there have been, for example, reports, I think originally in the FT, about the government sort of stepping in to stop some, particular deals when it comes to, an actual agreement with the RMT and train drivers and the train unions. Does that point to a government which is sort of suggesting down the line not having a deal and having more strikes plays into their hands?
Do you know, I spoke to a very senior member from the RMT. This was back in May or June. Boris Johnson was still in power, remember him? And they were making the point to me then, at that point, it was only the RMT that were striking or had already voted for industrial action. And they were saying what it felt like to them was that Boris Johnson wanted a fight with them because it made him look prime ministerial. Mm-hmm. It's the problem that the government's going to have coming down the tracks, regardless of the fact that we've had our third prime minister since Boris Johnson, is that the point they were making back then was, look, at the moment, it's just the RMT that are striking, and it's train drivers that are striking. And you get to look all strong and prime ministerial up against, some big burly train drivers on a picket line. Mm. The problem is when you have this contagion and you have it growing, nurses going on strike is a very different fight to have. So the Royal College of Nursing has been going for 106 years. They've never once voted for industrial action. These are people that we all know nurses, we've all met nurses. It's a vocation, right? You don't go into it thinking that you're going to be, making your millions. You go into it because you genuinely love people, you genuinely care people. It's a vocation that you want to be doing. I was on picket lines yesterday with nurses. A lot of them were devastated that they had to be there. The last thing in the world they want to do is not be in the hospitals caring for people. It's a different look for the government if they're having a row with union bosses for the RMT than it is when they're going up against nurses. And I think looking at the polling numbers, there's a lot of support for people going on strike at the moment.
Because I guess in some ways the tendency might be to sort of, try and sort of see it as portraying a Mick Lynch as a sort of like Arthur Scargill 2.0 minor strike. The government might see themselves as sort of the new, Thatcher government. But actually, perhaps the historical comparison is the actual winter of discontent before that in 78, 79. And
God,
at that point, that was a Labour.
Paint a rosy picture for it here, Kieran.
That was a Labour government in charge who got beaten at the ballot box.
Well, there have been
because
no
of that.
on strikes yet.
Yeah.
So we've got. Come on, give us something give us some sort of cold comfort. To latch
Is
onto.
the cold comfort that inflation, despite it still being high, it was slightly lower, wasn't it, recently?
Yeah, I mean, we're still. So talk to economists at the moment. They're hoping, no one knows for certain at the moment, they want to see a couple of months worth of data, but it looks like inflation may have peaked and it's starting to come down. But when you talk to them about their projections for next year, you're still looking at inflation rates. They're still working towards inflation rates by the end of next year of like 5%. 5% inflation is still quite high. Compared to what we're seeing at the moment, more than half. 5% inflation is still high. And remember as well, the inflation rate is the rate at which prices are going up and up and up, right?
Yep.
They're not coming down. So the inflation rate might come down, but the prices that are high now, I guarantee that those prices are going to come down. Your earning potential is still less than it was, 2 years ago.
So I was right to be negative.
Yeah, you were right to be miserable as hell and look forward to absolutely nothing.
Yeah, just confirming that. I mean, Paul, moving on, a lot of the strikes are taking place, obviously, as we were talking about, high inflation, the cost of living crisis, us being in a recession. And a huge impact on all of this has been the war in Ukraine, not just here, but also on the global economy. It's been nearly 10 months since the war began on February the 24th. Let's just take a look back.
10 months already.
10 months. Let's just take a look back now at some of our reporting at Channel 4 News on the war in Ukraine.
President Putin of Russia has unleashed war in our European continent.
He appealed to their courage, summoning the millions of citizen defenders, telling them to take up arms, imploring them not to panic.
Leaders of the West were woken in the dead of night to the news they all feared. The world had changed. Here in the southern city of Mariupol, the bombardment has been relentless.
There has been a shift in mindset, an unease, a realization once again of just what Russia is willing to do.
Putin's war has caused a surge in global food and energy prices, raising the cost of living everywhere, including here at home.
40% of the EU's gas comes from Russia, and as bombs drop, oil and gas still flows, so too does €1 billion a day to the nation that invaded Ukraine.
There was some reporting there from you when you went to a NATO training exercise. I mean, isn't that also one big story as well, which I guess from your reporting about the cohesion of the West and NATO since this war began?
You went to Finland as well, right?
I did go to Finland, yes.
You must have seen it there as well. The mindset had changed, right?
Yeah.
Speaking to Norwegian troops while we were out there, they've got a border there with Russia, very small border. And, for years, for decades, it had been the thing that they trained for, but do we really need to, it's right at the back of their mind. Do they actually need to ever worry about action against Russia? And all of a sudden, when Ukraine was invaded, they were battle ready straight away. And you could see right now as front and foremost in people's mind. What was it like in Finland?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the story in Finland, which I've banged on about loads on this podcast and in general to everyone who knows me, Yeah, it's that complete change in the mindset. Finland had always sort of wanted to have a sort of cordial relationship with Russia.
Yeah.
They were never really in favour of joining NATO. The population, I think it was around sort of the low 20% wanted to join NATO before the war, and then after the war you saw it basically triple in a number of weeks. That is despite the warnings of what might happen if they do eventually join NATO. Obviously that's still currently on hold because Hungary and Turkey have still not approved them joining. But also that sense of people wanting and willing to take on those risks of what might be Russia retaliation, as well as people wanting to say, actually, we know that this might economically hit us as well, which I guess has also been the big story, which you've reported on a lot, is seeing the consequences of this war on the economy, on energy prices, all of that. I mean, when did you first sort of notice it?
It felt almost an awkward thing to be talking about or reporting. We had lots of conversations about how we tackle it because right from the get-go, from day one of the war, you saw prices, commodity prices going through the roof. You saw prices increasing even in the run-up to the war. But on day one of the war, the really interesting one was grain prices flew through the roof. A third of the world's grain comes from Ukraine. Grain is used for pretty much everything. It's the building blocks of most foods. So, straight away you saw bread prices going up. Foodstuffs for a lot of developing nations get their foodstuffs from Ukraine. You saw all those prices go through. And you've got the economic impact. But you had this thing of like, people are losing their lives in Ukraine. It's an awkward conversation now to be talking about, but we're all going to start feeling a bit broke soon because it's going to have an impact on all of us. But the ripples of what happened in Ukraine have been spread across the entire globe.
Last time when we talked at the beginning of 2022 or the end of 2021, we were talking then about soaring prices and the economic situation. Was it already looking bad anyway? And then this has sort of exacerbated it? Because I guess there's a discussion now, isn't it, when you talk about this government or other governments and they get criticised for high inflation, not doing enough, they go, well, look, it's all about the Ukraine war, when actually some of these issues, supply chains, whatever, were happening before.
Yeah, and a lot of the messaging, a lot of the government messaging, and a lot of the lines that ministers have tried to fall back on time and time again. You saw it over the Tory leadership race. Everything was tried to be described through this prism of Russia's war in Ukraine, and that's causing the cost of living crisis. But I think exactly the point you just made. We were talking about this a year ago. Russia's invasion of Ukraine put rocket boosters on the cost of living crisis and commodity prices and gas prices going through the roof. But they were already on an upward trend. Things were already very expensive. Inflation was already going high. You had supply chain problems because of COVID. We're just getting to the point now where China is changing their COVID policy. Most of the world's stuff is made in China. That's having a big impact on everything. You already had commodity prices increasing anyway. All of that was already there before Russia invaded Ukraine.
I was always under the assumption that, when it came to the war in Ukraine, it was all about, Russia controlling the supply of gas to places like Germany. It was always that Germany was going to hit by this really badly. But I thought we don't get much of our gas from Russia, etc. Why are we still feeling the effects? Is it just the knock-on?
Yeah, it's knock-on. Global prices go up, or we're all going to feel the impact. There's no escape, really. And especially when so much of the world's gas is generated from Russia. And then you put embargoes about how much we want to give them. You saw in one of the reports there, $1 billion a day is flowing to Russia at a time when we're meant to be doing sanctions on them left, right and centre.
Yep.
That's a difficult moral maze to navigate, right?
Brexit is, a year ago we were talking about it loads. We haven't really spoken about it much this year in general.
What are you talking about? Brexit's done. You had an election in 2019. Get Brexit done.
But is that the point now? Is that some people are beginning to mention it? Maybe not the leaders of both parties. But is that something which might come into the fore again next year? That the question starts to be asked, what are the effects of Brexit? And has that got anything to do with the UK economy?
Yeah, those questions haven't stopped being asked in certain quarters. It's not something the government is terribly keen to be talking about.
Nor the Labour Party.
Nor the Labour Party. If you look at the trading numbers about the amount of trade that we're doing, export that we're doing, they are the numbers are down since Brexit. But it's a tricky, we're only 2 years away from, less than 2 years now, from the next general election. The government's not really going to be, that's not going to be the issue that they're going to be tub-thumping about going to the polls again.
Which is a good point to therefore, talking about general election and politics, to discuss.
Has there been much politics this year?
Yeah, I think maybe. If we look back at the past year, the year of the 3 prime ministers. So let's look back at some of the highlights from this year in political news.
There were things we simply did not get right.
Welcome to this special programme from Downing Street and the end of Boris Johnson's turbulent career.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
I have a bold plan to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II.
A silent eulogy, spoken in footsteps, measured in miles, and in the many hours spent waiting in the cold.
With surprise extra tax cuts funded by borrowing, the pound fell even more.
Mr. Kwarteng left Downing Street, no longer Chancellor.
I know that brighter days lie ahead.
Some mistakes were made.
We will reverse almost all the tax measures announced in the growth plan.
A walkout from over 100,000 postal workers.
Prepare for a nightmare at Christmas.
A series of rail strikes landing the week before Christmas.
Stability and certainty right now don't seem to appear on the horizon.
So let's just go up to the moment when Boris Johnson finally resigned. So we had Partygate, which was a big talking point starting from last December.
Sue Gray, do you remember Sue Gray?
We had Sue Gray. We had the initial findings from her report, I think in January. Then we had Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were both fined. None of that caused Boris Johnson to lose MP support until, don't you remember, it was the Monday morning after the Queen's Platinum Jubilee that Sir Graham Brady said the threshold be met. We had a vote of confidence. Boris Johnson survived. And then it all came to a head with his behaviour and his lying around Chris Pincher. And that eventually saw Boris Johnson's downfall. And that happened in the sort of 24 hours after Rishi Sunak, the then Chancellor, and Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, they both resigned.
Everyone sort of forgets about Sajid Javid in this.
Yeah.
During the leadership race over the summer.
Which one was that?
After Boris Johnson, that one.
Yeah.
Leadership race then, and you go around, you talk to Tory party members. There was real anger among lots of them towards Rishi Sunak as being like, the man who held the dagger.
Yep.
But it was Sajid Javid. He was the first one that resigned. People sort of forget about him.
Where were you when that happened? Because I think it happened like an hour before we went to Ed, didn't it?
Yeah,
it happened all of a sudden.
It did. It's funny of these things, isn't it? They happen really, really slowly and then very, very quickly.
Yep.
Yeah, because there was so much discontent in Westminster. So many little groups of annoyed Conservative MPs all sort of plotting in different ways and trying to get rid of Boris. And then all of a sudden, it happened. Sajid Javid put in his letter of resignation, and I was walking through Westminster. I bumped into a senior female MP who was no fan of Boris Johnson, and I broke the news to her that Sajid Javid was resigned, and her face just completely changed. She was like, "That's it, it's happening." And then within like 15 minutes, you get Rishi Sunak's resignation. And then you've got, I think it was the next 48 hours, where you just had minister after minister after minister resigning and Michael Gove being fired.
Yeah. Because, everyone says it's all about Partygate, which clearly started, the ball rolling for the end of Boris Johnson. But it is also, I think, very important that, what happened around Chris Pincher and the fact that he was putting out cabinet members with misinformation. That was a really important thing, I think, which we sometimes forget.
There's also another step before that. Remember the Owen Paterson affair?
Yep.
In, November 2021. So for people that don't remember, you had Owen Paterson, who was sanctioned by Parliament, and then there was a rouse to, there was sort of plot so that he wouldn't have to be sanctioned by Parliament. And it was one of those moments of the Conservative, Boris Johnson, it was planned by Jacob Rees-Mogg. Boris Johnson agreed to it. march Tory MPs to the top of the hill, get them to back this plan, which a lot of MPs did not want to back. They were quite happy for Owen Paterson to be sanctioned. And then there's a massive U-turn, and lots of Tory MPs are like, well, you've just made us look like idiots now. And then you have Partygate, and then you have Chris Pinch, and you have this accumulative effect of Tory MPs time and time again. This is what they told us how they felt. Time and time again, they were being asked to defend the indefensible.
In a period where it feels like the issue of sexual assault within Westminster has come to the fore, and allegations around that, incredibly important to stress, that Boris Johnson, had known about these allegations about Chris Pincher. And that's, ultimately what led to his downfall was the fact that he was not being truthful about that.
Yeah, and there were a couple of ultra Boris loyalist MPs, junior ministers actually, that resigned. And I was talking to one of them, and he was saying, look, I will go out, I back Boris, I have the whole way, I owe my seat to him. And I would go out and back him to the hill, but I can't defend untruths.
It did take a while for Boris Johnson to finally actually resign. Is that not part of the theme as well of this year, especially when it comes to, the fall of Liz Truss, which we'll get onto? That idea of Boris Johnson lingering now in the backbenches, always, the thought of him coming back.
Well, I mean, he nearly did.
Yeah.
When Liz Truss was deposed of, Boris Johnson was on holiday, Dominican Republic, was it? He got on a plane back, and as it was confirmed, he had 100 MPs that backed him. He had this Zoom call when on I think it was a Sunday night when he was telling everyone he wasn't going to run, and I spoke to some of the MPs who his backers that were on the MP, and they were apoplectic that he was not going to put himself up for it.
That obviously takes us on to, the next two prime ministers we had, Liz Truss and then Rishi Sunak. That whole summer hustings period where the general narrative was Liz Truss has this sewn up.
Yeah.
And then we saw the result. And actually, she still beat Rishi Sunak, but it wasn't as momentous a victory as one thought, as, larger majority. Perhaps the media narrative was a bit too, this is clear cut.
Yes, the margin wasn't quite as big as everyone was expecting, but I think she still got nearly 2/3 of the vote. She won hands down with party members, and it was incredible as well. That was the feeling right from the get-go.
A few days after she won the leadership race and she became prime minister, we saw the death of Queen Elizabeth II. A momentous moment. Looking back, Paul, especially on some of the reporting you had to do, it was clearly the end of an era. And there was a lot of talk about what is the new era under King Charles III. Do you think in some ways we hammed it up a bit too much in the sense of, yes, it was the end of a momentous life and reign, but nothing really changes that much, does it?
I don't know. I think for a lot of people, she was a constant. For most of us, unless you're 90 odd, you won't have remembered any other monarch. Life has changed so much in that period through which she reigned. From a time when there were no TVs, and the monarch's almost like a borderline deity. That is in this massive house in palace in London. You have no connection to whatsoever, and you go through the age of the TV, through the social media, through to seeing constant feeds of people day in day out, and she transcended all of that. Can I tell you my story about on the day when the Queen died?
She passed on the Thursday.
This was terrifying.
Yeah.
Utterly terrifying. Broadcasters all over the world have prepared, for this moment. But it's still a moment in history which you want to get right. So we know that, we knew through the day that she was ill. And I got told, right, we need a report able to go on air. However, by the time we go on air, she may have passed away. So you need to make 2 reports simultaneously at the same time, ready to go on air.
Wow.
And, first of all, it's a lot of work. Second of all, it's the biggest story, that you're going to report on, and you want everything to be absolutely right. Then the announcement came, I think it was like 6:20, and we get told, actually, we're going to go on air in 10 minutes, and your report needs to be ready like straight away. And it's the most terrified I've ever been with a report going on air.
We then had the 10 days of mourning, obviously, the state funeral, and then within days, we had Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget. I think we all know what happened there. That led to the downfall of Liz Truss and then her being replaced by Rishi Sunak, who I guess has been there to sort of say, you know, steady hand on the tiller, sorting out the mess of that, getting through this winter period. What are we seeing, therefore, Paul, in terms of poll numbers? Has he managed to, in some way, resurrect the Conservative Party at all?
It feels very much right now among Tory MPs that the writing is on the wall and they will not be in government after the next general election. This always happens in an election cycle. You get people who are retiring. These aren't old duffers that are retiring. These are, you got Sajid Javid.
Old duffers,
they're not. It's not like some grey-haired bloke who you never heard of, who's retiring to his house in the country.
Yeah,
these are young people in their prime who, under normal circumstances, you would think, well, they've got a big career ahead of them.
Dahina Davison, yeah.
Dahina Davison, she's only 29.
Yeah,
and she's 29 and she's already a junior minister. The Conservatives aren't in power come the next election. That is still someone who has a bright political future ahead of them, should they want to do it. Chloe Smith, she's what, 40, I think, 41, still very young. Sajid Javid, early 50s, but I mean, he's had pretty much every cabinet post going. He's someone that you would imagine would be one of the future greybeards of the Conservative Party.
He has got a grey beard.
And he has got a rugged grey beard now. But these are all people that are just saying, no, I'm out.
We often try and sort of predict what's going to happen next year. I guess one easy prediction is there won't be 3 prime ministers, presumably just one.
Yeah. I'm knackered. I could do with a bit of a rest.
But I mean, whenever the next election happens, it seems ridiculous to assume it's a foregone conclusion, right?
Yeah, and if you talk to Labour and people in Keir Starmer's office, they are very worried about complacency and this idea of we've got it all sewn up. I think there are still really big question marks about where Labour stands on a lot of issues. And, you can't just be the we're not them party. Their party conference a couple of months back, it felt like a very professional outfit. It felt like a party that is on the march to winning the next general election. But they are terrified about that complacency slipping in.
Quickly, Paul, before we finish, any predictions for next year?
I'm not making a single prediction.
Okay.
Everything. I think we did this last year, and I don't ever want to go through it because I'm pretty sure everyone will go, this guy ain't got a clue about anything. Wrong.
Well, I found it very illuminating.
I'll tell you what we did make. We did make one prediction.
What was it?
Because we spoke about what's the Tory party got to do. And we said, well, they've got try and look vaguely competent.
Yeah.
And get through, and Boris Johnson might survive.
So that was a decent prediction then.
Try and look vaguely competent. I mean, it didn't go so well.
Paul McNamara, thank you very much for talking to me.
No, Kieran. Thank you.